Good evening. I'm Gavin Cleespies, the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I'm happy to welcome you to our first program of our fall 2022 season. The Massachusetts Historical Society is an independent nonprofit organization. We maintain a massive research library with an amazing collection of material. We have the papers of 3 of the first 6 presidents of the United States and close to 14 million manuscript pages in our collection. These include letters, diaries, journals, notes from authors, community leaders, and protesters. For the past 230 years, we've made our collections available to the public, and it's available to anyone who would like to come in and research in our library. We also host a wide variety of programs, and this fall we have a pretty amazing lineup of things planned. Just in the next week, we have 2 more programs. Tomorrow we're hosting our film club, which is very similar to a book club. You watch the movie on your own, you get together and you talk about it. The movie this time is a civil action, and we'll have special guest Jonathan Williams of Boston University will help lead the conversation. On Monday, we'll host an author talk on the book A Union Like Ours, the love story of F.O. Athenson and Russell Cheney, with Scott Bain from the John Hartford Foundation talking about his work. And then in the fall, sort of between now and Christmas, we have quite an amazing list of speakers. Just to point out a few highlights, we'll feature Pulitzer Prize winning author Stacy Schiff, who will be talking about her new book on Sam Adams with MHS's own Sarah Giorgini. We'll also host Eric J. Dolan. We'll talk about pirates. Donald Yakovone will be in conversation with Henry Louis Gates, talking about teaching white supremacy. Lydia Moyland will be in conversation with Pulitzer Prize winning author Megan Marshall, talking about her book on Lydia Maria Child, her biography of Lydia Maria Child. Joanne Freeman will be in conversation with Heather Cox Richardson. I'm not sure what they're going to be talking about, but it's just the 2 of them talking. And we'll also be hosting billionaire philanthropist David Rubenstein, who will be talking with MHS's own president, Catherine Al Gore. So we have quite a lineup of programs. Somehow most of them fall in November, but we have a spattering outside of November as well. We're only able to host programs like these thanks to the support of our members and donors. We hope everyone, speaking to the people in the room, I don't think we have to say this, but to the people online, we hope that you'll return for future events, and we hope that you'll support our work by becoming a member or making a donation. This evening, we have a great program. We'll hear from Professor Michael Meltsner on his new book, Mosaic, Who Paid for the Bullet? This work of historical fiction came from Professor Meltzner's deep personal knowledge of civil rights history. He currently is a professor at Northeastern Law School, where he formerly was the dean. But earlier in his career, he served as the first assistant counsel to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in the 1960s. His clients included the North Carolina doctors and dentists who ended Southern hospital racial segregation, Muhammad Ali, and death row inmates challenging capital punishments. He has been a Guggenheim Fellow and awarded an honorary doctorate from John Jay College, which described him as the principal architect of the death penalty abolition movement. So I think that he speaks from great personal experience, and please join me in welcoming him tonight.
Thank you, Gavin, and thank you all for coming. When I have taught during the pandemic, I've often taught hybrid, and the students are all arrayed back there. So my neck gets a lot of swiveling. So I want to say something to anyone on Zoom, which is simply, if you have any questions that you're unable to get circulated here, please feel free to write me. My email address is available through Northeastern Law School, or it's m.meltsner@northeastern.edu. But I'm happy to field any questions that come up from people who are virtual. So I'm going to talk for maybe 20 or 25 minutes. I'm going to talk about the unusual way this book came to be, why, even though the story is inspired by events that took place in the civil rights era, it conveys lessons about today's biggest life and death problem, in my opinion, and that's the gross racial and ethnic disparities in the healthcare system. But a few opening remarks. While there's certainly a legal context to Mosaic, this is not a book written for lawyers. It stands or falls, like any novel, on the characters whose plight you are interested in and whose situation engages you and your emotions. Secondly, while I will do a brief reading, I'm most interested in answering questions and talking to you. Law professors don't get very far if they just lecture. It's interactive, and I've been doing it for a long time, and I learn things that way. I learn a lot less when I just talk at my students. Finally, and maybe most importantly, I'm not giving anything away by telling you that the crucial event that led to this book was the mysterious death of a charismatic woman doctor in a large southern city. Her name was Jean Causert, and you've never heard of her, and that's because her death was never fully investigated. Now, last month, at the urging of a group of us at Northeastern, the Department of Justice has opened an investigation about her death. Federal law called the Emmett Till Law and the Cold Case Act authorized the DOJ to investigate civil rights-related killings that have not been fully investigated and as to which the outcomes are not fully understood. So there's just some background. Now let me take you to 1962, where I am as green a lawyer as you can imagine. I've just been hired maybe a year and a half earlier by Thurgood Marshall at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. That's not the same as the NAACP. One's a membership organization. The Legal Defense Fund is an organization of lawyers. It was once part of the NAACP and was the organization that brought Brown v. Board of Education. So I'm hired by Thurgood Marshall, and it's the height of the civil rights era. And suddenly my boss, who is the successor to Marshall, tells me he wants me to bring a test case aiming to end the exclusion and segregation of Black Americans at hundreds of hospitals and medical facilities, mostly in the South. And the case is unique in that it involves the only federal statute that authorizes racial segregation. So this is really my first big case, and I'm kind of nervous because I haven't been practicing law very, very long, but it results in a decision that required integration, but it left enforcement to the federal government. Hundreds of inspectors ultimately were assigned to monitor compliance. Most of the southern facilities simply sent pieces of paper in, the way school boards did in the 1960s. We're not discriminating. We're not discriminating. And so the Department of then HEW said, well, we need complaints. And so we got complaints, and finally they got their act together, and hundreds of inspectors were assigned to monitor compliance. And despite overcoming a great deal of resistance in the South, they produced results, but there were significant holdouts. The doctors at a major hospital complex in a big southern city made it look like African Americans were treated well and had integrated, but they had not. One story about how some of these hospitals behaved is this, the inspector came down, said, I want to see your hospital. The superintendent of the hospital took the inspector to a room. He said, we have a ward here. It's totally integrated. He opened the door and he said, look, 2 black men, 1 white man, and 1 Mexican. And the inspector looked at him and he said, but they're all in a coma. That's the kind of Potemkin village kind of stuff that was going on. Those are the kind of games. So this major facility in what I call in the novel Gulf City was visited by an inspector. And he was told by the staff in Washington that they understood exactly what was going on here because they had a mole. And the mole turned out to be this charismatic female doctor who was on the staff and was telling the people in Washington exactly what was going on. The high official who they sent down to negotiate with the hospital checked into a hotel room. He tried to reach her by phone to find out what was going on. The phone, he couldn't get through, so he called downstairs to the switchboard, and he gave them the number, and he reached her, and they talked, and the next couple of days he bargained with the hospital unsuccessfully, went back to Washington, and 10 days later, she was found dead on her front porch with a gun underneath her body. The police called the death an accident. The widespread gossip in Gulf City was that she was a lesbian, or maybe not. Maybe she had a black lover, or maybe not. Maybe she committed suicide. In any event, nothing happened. The newspaper ran a, excuse me, a story about 3 lines saying it was an accident. And there was no investigation, and the case was forgotten. Well, decades later, a prominent medical historian contacted me. He said, you were the leading civil rights lawyer who dealt with health care in the 60s. Would I investigate the death of this woman? He believed it was actually a murder. Well, with the help of Northeastern students and some of my colleagues, I gave it a try. We learned that witnesses were dead, suspects couldn't be found, probably deceased also, and records both in Washington and in Gulf City were non-existent. I had to tell the researcher that we were at a dead end, but had high-placed administrators at the hospital suddenly learned of her role. The few details that emerged were suggestive, but inconclusive. I just couldn't let it go, and the result is Mosaic, my second novel. If you want to get a sense of what it was like in the 60s when there was segregation in health facilities, there are just thousands of sad and just very disturbing stories. I'm just going to read you the briefest of little summary here because it's from Maya Angelou. And she recounted her ordeal at the hands of white physicians in the South by describing that she had a terrible, terrible impacted toothache. And her grandmother took her across the railroad tracks to a white dentist. And ironically, this white dentist owed the grandmother money. I'm not sure why, but he did. So she brought Maya to this dentist, ignoring her pain entirely. The dentist refused to treat her. And he said, it's my policy, I don't treat colored people. And when the grandmother pleaded with him, he memorably said, My policy is, and I'm quoting here, I'd rather stick my hand in a dog's mouth. Well, that's just a metaphor for what it was like. The classic situation is of a person who is in danger of death being refused emergency service and being told, oh, go to the other hospital if there was an other hospital. So let me read you a brief passage, give you a sense of what this book is like. Dr. Calsert in the book is called Dr. Clem, and she has a lover who's a former prosecutor his name is Chris North, and he has come to the South to work in the civil rights movement, and he's partnered with a great character, a local black lawyer. And he wants to know what radicalized Dr. Clem. And what I'm going to read to you is her reply. At first, I thought I could get along with the old boy network that controlled all but the woeful municipal clinic that treated African Americans and others not deemed worthy or wealthy enough to be admitted to Davis Memorial Hospital. Given where I'd been and what I knew, I just couldn't contain myself at medical society and hospital staff meetings. Even though I'd been welcomed, I felt it was superficial. The medical community had its way of doing things. I should be grateful that I was now a member of the anointed few. The gratitude involved not questioning the traditional arrangement, shelving concerns about the health of the community as a whole, or pointing out changes happening nationally to treatment and public health best practices. This sort of stuff was actually scorned by the local medical establishment. What bothered me most was the way the powers that be viewed the poor, white or black. I started out thinking that by coming home to the segregated South, I had to accept the terms and conditions of this way of life. But too much had happened to me in the war, in northern ERs where she was trained, in surgery rotations as an intern, and watching bodies come in with gunshots. I just couldn't live in the bubble of country club medicine. 2 incidents, one predictable, one tragic, drove me in the arms of personal opposition. Dr. Manny Dupre is an African-American pediatrician, the only one in Gulf City. Much in demand in his community, certified in his specialty by the appropriate national board, he's a totally non-political animal. Manny is a laid-back kind of guy and really a serious scientist. He applied to the Gulf City chapter of the State Medical Society to be able to attend lectures about scientific issues. He had no interest in socializing with the all-white membership and less in futilely applying for staff membership at Davis Memorial. Even when a child in his care required admission, and this is common in the South, he had to turn his patient over to a white doctor with the staff admitting privileges because he had none. Not only was Manny's application to attend the society lectures denied, it was not really discussed. What I heard from colleagues was a few brief doublespeak comments, but one white pediatrician who regularly took over patients from Dr. Dupree so they could be admitted to Davis Memorial was remarkably frank. He said that if a colored doctor moved up in the pecking order and ultimately used society membership as a foothold to gain admitting privileges, his own income would be seriously impaired. The only other comment was from the society president, the reigning chief at Davis Memorial, a man named Hedley Ronson, who said no formal vote on the application was necessary, as it was obvious it would be unanimously rejected. Ronson told us that big changes along these lines were being hatched in Washington, and the society, as the voice of medical quality in Gulf City and surrounding areas, needed toughness to protect its prerogatives. I was about to speak before Ronson abruptly moved down the agenda, but the words wouldn't come. They tumbled from my mind to my throat and lay there, weighed down by anger and, I have to admit, fear. When I brought the news to Manny, expecting fury and bitterness, he thanked me for my support, betrayed no emotion, and only said, "What did you expect?" The second incident took place months later when I felt I was more settled in the choice to return to Gulf City. I not only took a position, but provided as much by the way I did it, I provoked as much by the way I did it as that I did it. An African-American teenager had shoplifted 2 bags of potato chips from an East Side mini market. The employee at the checkout, also African-American, had confronted him. The boy brandished a knife, and the employee pulled a gun from behind the counter and shot the boy twice. Then he calmly called the police and told them to order an ambulance. The boy was taken to Davis Memorial, but the emergency room refused to treat him, directing the driver, who was new, in strong language to take him to the municipal clinic. When they got there, the boy was DOA. I came to the society meeting the next week with a written resolution directed to all Gulf City medical facilities, urging that emergency cases should be admitted immediately on the basis of patient condition, regardless of social or other factors. I came to the meeting room early, laid copies of the resolution on the chairs and the desk from which Ronson would chair the meeting. After the usual anteroom chatter over white wine and canopies that preceded the formal gathering, the members entered the meeting room, glanced at the paper, and turned silent. When Ronson spoke, he thanked me by name, our newly arrived colleague straight from Boston. He thanked me for my humanitarian efforts. And then he said, "But of course, we don't deal with political matters." He crumpled the paper and tossed it aside. Scared as I was, I took a deep breath, stood and looked straight at him and said, "Dr. Ronson, I would like the sense of the meeting on this." Ronson again offered thanks for my concern, but ignored my request. He moved to the first item on the agenda, which had to do with raising the dues for the next fiscal year. I looked around at my colleagues, hoping for some support, but no one looked back. It was only then that I fully understood what it was like to be alone. I had to choose to stay or go, and if I stayed, I'd have to do something. Whatever something meant at the time, I had no idea. But soon I took a small step. Seemed so piddling, but it shocked many. I let white and black patients sit together in my private office waiting room. My receptionist quit. I lost a few patients, but at least I'd broken out of the vacuum. So medical care racism and disparities were never really a priority for the federal government, or, it must be admitted, the civil rights movement. You can read book after book, article after article, see video after video about the civil rights movement, and they never mention health care. Why? Why, one wonders. Well, it's a fragmented system in this country, and that may make healthcare issues difficult to deal with in a systematic fashion. Sick people want to get well, not necessarily get involved in litigation. And maybe death and dying are issues that Americans want to stay away from. But today, things are somewhat different in the sense that we're overwhelmed with evidence and data that healthcare disparities are rampant. I don't have to give you a lot of statistics, but I will anyway. Blacks are 13% of the US population, 5% of doctors. Black and Asian women are 2 to 3 times higher for pregnancy-related deaths than white women. Blacks have higher rates of diabetes, hypertension, heart disease than other groups. Black children have a 500% higher death rate from asthma compared to white children. Whites are more likely than African Americans to receive life-saving treatment for addiction in a emergency room. When cardiac catheterization is called for, Black men do badly. Black women do worse than white men or women. And of course, it's pretty well known that the death rate for COVID and infant mortality is wildly disparate. If the experience in the 60s with the ending segregation had been followed by serious actions by government and I have to admit, by civil rights organizations, things might be different. But today we have an enormous amount of evidence about these disparities, but not a lot of effective action. You can read about it, you can see it on the tube, you can read it on blogs, but changes are very, very slow. So I think we need less talk, more action, and a centralization of healthcare institutions, and they have to be viewed, the regulation of healthcare institutions, and they have to be viewed with an equity lens. There has to be a kind of report card and a cabinet level official or someone like that with the mandate to produce actions that end these disparities. The number of disparities is awesome, and the number of problems in a very, very complex set of institutions is equally so. Just one example is that to make progress here, you have to get in and changing algorithms, because many of the algorithms are structurally biased. Perhaps the greatest thing that has to be done is that doctors and others in the healthcare system maybe have to listen more to people of color, and there have to be more doctors and nurses of people of color. So thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions if I haven't talked you into submission.
I'm sure Professor Meltzner would be happy to answer any questions from members of the audience, if anyone has some. But just to get us started, so the case that you mentioned, it starts out with a charismatic doctor, and you mentioned that the Department of Justice was now looking into that. How optimistic are you that there will be a resolution or more information?
I'm not optimistic because these events occurred so long ago, and our search did not come up with anything. But the Department of Justice and the FBI have resources that we don't have, and one never knows what they might come up with. But I think it's important in a modest way that they're doing this because they're focusing on an event that otherwise was invisible. And so, I mean, again, the novel is a work of fiction. It's not the kind of nonfiction book that I've written in other situations that I would have written here if I had the evidence. But the exposure of the situation led to the book, and maybe the book will have some impact on people. One never knows.
Thank you. It's sort of beyond the scope of your book, but I was wondering if you could comment on the extent to which you think the racial aspect is part of the broader problems of our medical system, which is so profit-oriented and tied to insurance, tied to things that have nothing to do specifically with healthcare.
Oh, absolutely. So Imagine you were a young person in 1968, and you maybe were, in college or graduate school or old teenager, and you were interested in medicine. If you were Black, you would have learned that the American Medical Association did not accept Black people until 1968. You would not have eagerly gone into the medical profession. Acts like that have consequences over time. I mean, people all know about the Tuskegee syphilis and things like that. There's terrible mistrust, and understandably so, in the Black community. And then, of course, poverty is the greatest form of violence we have, in a way. So race and poverty and to a certain extent ethnicity, because it's not restricted only to African Americans, are the background of these disparities. You can't understand these disparities unless you put those things in play. I have colleagues who I've worked with in various contexts about healthcare who will start telling you about individual situations. Some of them are disgusting. Some of them suggest explicit bias. Some of them suggest sort of dumbness, not intentionality, but just blindness of one sort or another. But the solution to these things is systemic. The healthcare system is just so enormously complicated. And the consumers of it have so many burdens that you need not only an effort by government and large institutions, but a systematic and centralized, in my judgment, response. That's why, going back to the earlier question, that's why I think the DOJ action is small. It's a very small thing, but it's that kind of an approach. Yeah.
So, I mean, you do have hospitals today where the vast majority of the patients are people of color. So, in that respect, we are in a different place. I mean, we are in
Well, I don't think you have segregation anymore or exclusion, but the question is, how are they treated? And what about the people who aren't there? And why these disparate numbers are so consistent across the entire scope. It's not like somebody's come up with a bad number and said, look at this. I mean, the number of research papers that establish disparity is really overwhelming. So something is happening, but and of course there are many places where the patients are not primarily minority.
So I was wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about your writing process. I mean,
About the writing process?
yes, because it is true that literature is probably one of the best ways to bring across social issues in really a more acceptable manner. But in writing the novel, you kind of have this competing tension of having to have a plot and a climax, and at the same time, you're trying to bring forth some of these social issues. So I'm just a little curious about your writing process.
Well, my first book was about the death penalty and about our efforts at the Legal Defense Fund to deal with the death penalty that ultimately ended it for 4 years in the United States. And out of that book, I acquired one of the great editors in America at the time. He probably out of an act of more friendship or sympathy, decided to publish my first novel. And what I discovered in writing that novel, it's called Short Takes. You can buy it for 49 cents, I'm sure, on Amazon. And if so, it will create a minion that some of you would know what I mean. What I discovered in writing that was the incredible freedom that you, as a well-published law professor and editor, would know. I didn't have to cite anything. I could make that up. No, my character said X, not Y, and I didn't have to have something down the bottom of the page or in the back that said, oh yes, well, Professor XYZ has said this too. So there was a great freedom in a way, but I felt compelled because I was the only lawyer at the Legal Defense Fund for 10 years who dealt with healthcare cases. The case I described, just one of them. It's not that I was especially knowledgeable, it was not that that's what I did mostly. It's just that fell to me. And so I felt a certain responsibility for this story. And so I had to do it. And then I think two things helped me along. One is that my wife writes great books, and she's sitting in another room in the house, and if I don't get going, she'll be ahead of me. And secondly, the pandemic probably allowed me a little more time that I might have had otherwise. Thank you for the question.
I just wondered, were you involved in the efforts to desegregate Grady Hospital in Atlanta?
In the what?
Grady
in Atlanta?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I guess my question is, do you really think that there's a big distinction between Atlanta on the one hand and Montgomery, St. Augustine, Albany, and Birmingham on the other?
I'm sorry. You'll have to say that again.
So I grew up in Atlanta, and we were always taught we were the city too busy to hate. There's something special about us. Was that your experience? No, not really.
Sorry. I worked on the case that integrated restaurants like Meltsner'a with a famous lawyer named Constance Baker. I would say I felt safe. Oh, I'm sorry. My mistake. I would say I felt safer in Atlanta than in other places I've been. Certainly safer than in Alabama. And the lawyers I worked with in Georgia were exceptional people. One of them was beaten up by a sheriff early in the civil rights movement. They ended up naming a post office after him. And others another one became a federal judge years later. So I was dealing with some very estimable Black lawyers there. And finally, that was where SNCC was at the time, which was complicated. That's another book. So I'm not sure exactly how Grady sorted out, but I was more a consultant in the Grady situation than in other cases.
We have a question online from Jean, who asks, what, if anything, is being done to encourage or recruit medical professionals of color today?
Well, there are efforts all along the board, but the proof is in the the proof is the pudding. We'll see what happens. But I think the medical establishment in many, many parts of the country is very sensitive about this issue, and I think good things are happening. Like the rest of the country, there are divergences. But the numbers are so pessimistic or sad that a lot has to be done. And that also, that leads me to comment on medical education. A lot more has to be done in medical schools to talk about these disparities and the problems underlying them. The curriculums are not nearly there in most places. And in others, they have to be developed more. Now, some medical schools like Harvard Medical School down the avenue have brought in people who are tasked with changing this. But I haven't seen dramatic changes, but I'm hopeful.
Just to follow up on this, it's not even the curriculum, but the cost. My daughter actually went to Emory Medical School and worked at Brady, and the cost of medical school makes it almost prohibitive for people of color to join.
Absolutely. You need it's just the number of issues that keep coming up. I mean, what you need is scholarship programs. I have a colleague in Australia. This may sound like inside baseball, I hope not. But you know, the Supreme Court many years ago limited affirmative action. And it has two cases before it in the fall that may end affirmative action. And the case way back was a medical school case called Backey. And this colleague in Australia who I'm working with over these issues wrote a list of things that should be done. And she said, get rid of Backey. And she's not quite plugged into what the Supreme Court is today. It'd be nice, but it ain't gonna happen. How much was the tuition? Or maybe you don't want to say.
It's like close to 70,000. I mean, that's substantial. And that's just the tuition and not a, you know. That was the whole thing.
But I mean, I will report to you that she talked often about attention to the equal provision of care. This was, in fact, in her experience at Emory, something
Really?
that was talked about.
Well, that's great.
And she found her experience as a student working at Grady to be fulfilling because she felt it was so great that she could be providing medical care to people who were, in many cases, had gone, you know, a decade without getting any.
Yeah, I think the Atlanta situation is very different than it was back in the day. And also, she's your daughter. I'm not sure everybody has the same pedigree.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your background. So you ended up early in your career working for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Where had you grown up? Where did you come from? And how shocking was the situations that you found?
I'm a New Yorker. And when I came up here in 1979 to be the dean, people said, you can't do that. You don't have a passport. But the biggest moment of my integration into this community is, you see, in New York City, when you were a high school student, when I was a high school student, you could get a card called the GO card, which allowed you into Madison Square Garden for $1 or $1.50. And so I played hooky many times, or told my parents I was going somewhere else, and watched both the New York Rangers and the New York Knicks before they were what they are today. But always, 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 the Celtics beat the Knicks. It was cruel and unusual punishment. So in 1979, we moved up here, and I went to the old Boston Garden once or twice with colleagues, and I watched or listened to the Celtics. And it suddenly dawned on me that I lived here now, and I could root for them. And this was when Larry Bird came. So that's a roundabout answer. I grew up in Manhattan, and I think my work career and my feelings about what I did have a lot to do with growing up in a multi-ethnic situation, even though it was often a very violent one. Thank you.
So I think that we may have finished the questions. So I just want to thank Professor Michael Meltzner for speaking, and we have books available. And for those of us joining us online, books are available, I believe, through Amazon, but we'll send a link to wherever they're at.
Amazon, Barnes and Noble,
Bookstore. We'll find it.
even some books.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thanks for coming.